Are streaming platforms becoming victims of their own success? They've revolutionized the way that we consume TV shows and movies. Whereas before you had to have the right channels, pre-record or rush home to watch your shows, or own piles of DVDs, you can now legally watch an almost endless supply of your favorite media on one or a few digital platforms.
How many of you are there?
They also have additional features such as recommendations based on your viewing habits and the ability to have a watch list. However, with the success that streaming platforms have received over the years, it's possible that there are a few lingering dark spots that are now beginning to rear their ugly heads in full view of the public. Just how much of a negative effect has this innovation had on our viewing experience? Join me as I investigate why this may be the case, and maybe you'll find that you've noticed what I have.
Squawk Box this morning, the transition from traditional television to streaming services has led to a major cord cutting across the country.
I'm so tired of streaming services popping up all over the place like a fucking plague.
We are canceling the show.
What?
Why? If there's anything I've learned, it's nobody knows anything except the algorithm.
The algorithm!
Why are you f***ing with me? Why are you f***ing with me? Why are you f***ing with me?
What is it like to come back with a show that was so well received?
It's an interesting experience. I've never been through it before, a second season of anything. Everything I've done has gotten canceled.
Shows are often cancelled because they have not generated enough money to be considered worth the cost. But how can they when they aren't given the time? Think about Breaking Bad, a TV show that's considered to be one of the greatest of all time. Many people agree that it has a slow start, which makes me think that if it was released for the first time in today's streaming world, it never would have had the chance to reach the heights that it did. In my opinion, the biggest drawback of these platforms has to be the rate at which their shows get cancelled. Traditionally, a show would be pitched to a TV network, and they would decide if the show was worth taking a gamble on. Normally, a pilot would be tested, and a show would be picked up for a full season after that. Once that season was finished, then they'd have to make a decision on whether or not they would continue to produce it. This decision is normally influenced by how much money the show generated and how many viewers it received. While these are fine metrics to go by, especially for the traditional TV format, I don't believe they always translate well to streaming sites. Netflix, Disney+, Amazon Prime, etc. create their own content as well as host pre-existing content that was created elsewhere. When it comes to TV shows, most of them will have an entire season released at once for people to binge watch. This is a great formula for people who want to sit down and become entrenched in a news story as soon as possible. Another advantage of a streaming platform is that you don't need to watch a show straight away on the day it is released. You can wait until you finally get the time to settle down, or even just watch it in installments at your leisure. However, the decision makers behind the streaming platforms seem to use the same old criteria to decide the success of a show.
This right here is my favorite thing ever. In the history of forever. I think about this every day. I think about this all night long. I stay awake, not sleeping, because I'm thinking about this.
Let's say that the first season of a new show is fully released on the first Friday of a particular month. The decision makers will set an arbitrary target for the show that is apparently known only to them. If the show does not reach that target by the end of that particular month, it's entirely possible that the platform will announce the show's cancellation within a few weeks after that. At least under the old TV network system, episodes were released on a weekly basis, thus giving the shows a longer time to generate buzz and increase viewership or ad revenue over time. Of course, when having this discussion, we can't forget the biggest consequence of cancellation: the lack of closure.
Let me in! Let me in!
Some show writers have the foresight to predict they might not get renewed. In anticipation of this, they rush their story in order to provide as satisfactory an ending as possible. Ironically, this leads to a drop in quality that ultimately allows executives to justify the eventual cancellation. Netflix's live-action adaptation of Cowboy Bebop deviated from the original anime in the order that certain plot points took place. It comes across as if they wanted to include as much recognizable material from the anime in the first season of their adaptation, so that fans would be pleased with the similarity, even if the show didn't get renewed. On the flip side of this dilemma are shows that go at a slow pace, laying the groundwork for many characters and storylines that will go unfulfilled when they get cancelled before a second season. If a loyal fanbase is lucky, then perhaps the show will get a movie, or in some cases even a comic book to wrap up the story. Obviously, with the amount of shows that get made in a year, it's no surprise that some of them will get cancelled, but at the rate the industry is going now, people are left asking the question, what's the point in getting invested in the first place? What we have left is a string of shows that raise questions that audiences will never get answers to. Let's look at The Acolyte, for example. It takes place in a time period that has not been explored in live-action Star Wars, and ends with unanswered questions that do have consequences on the franchise. I won't go into too much detail, as you can still watch the first season for yourself on Disney+, but the story introduced certain plot points and details that the writers definitely were planning to resolve with a second season. If I were a gambling man, I would say for sure that the writers wouldn't have included these extra details if they knew they could only have this one season to include them. Not to mention the fact these plot points have proven to be controversial with the fans, thus adding to the frustration of the lack of closure. There was a time when action or drama shows would get on average 22 episodes per season, with each episode being 40 minutes to an hour. When you combine this with the fact that the episodes were released on a weekly basis, storylines felt like they had the right amount of care put into them and were fleshed out as much as necessary. Of course, there would be the occasional filler episode, but as long as it was executed properly, then it would be a welcome experience for the viewers. The industry today has taken a different approach to episode formatting. More often than not, fans need to wait up to 2 years before the next season of their favourite show, only to be given a maximum of 8 episodes, roughly half an hour to an hour long. Let's break this format down in a hypothetical worst case scenario for a first season. The first 2 episodes are to introduce us to the main characters and establish the outline of the story. An exciting incident happens around episode 3 or 4, followed by backstory in episode 5, and possibly a shorter episode 6 that could have been tacked on to the previous episode. Then, episode 7 sets up episode 8, where all the narrative branches are expected to be neatly wrapped up in a satisfactory way for the audience. With a format like this, you have no room for hit or miss episodes, and this is still assuming that we get 8 episodes to begin with. Certain shows are only willing to go up to 6.
That can't be it. Where's the rest of it?
The pressure to hook an audience into a story increases exponentially when you have fewer episodes to do it. Granted, the 22 episode format may be too much at times. You do run the risk of audiences forgetting certain plot points, especially if the episodes are released on a weekly basis.
Who the f*** is this?
But there has to be a solid number in the middle that does the trick. I think back to the Marvel Netflix shows, such as Daredevil, Jessica Jones, etc. These shows had on average about 13 episodes per season. They managed to delve into the characters' backstories, establish imminent and ongoing storylines, as well as have a good amount of action to balance the build-up. Why is this phenomenon such a hard thing to replicate? I look back on shows made by Disney+, like The Acolyte or Moon Knight, and I feel like they lack a lot of rewatchable episodes. To clarify, I'm not necessarily saying that the quality is bad. I just feel like a lot of these episodes are not satisfying to watch on their own. It's like they only exist to drive forward a much bigger plot, rather than provide a self-contained piece of entertainment. This style of storytelling lends itself to be binged all at once, yet these episodes are released weekly. With all the shows that get produced nowadays, it's inevitable that there will be a few monumental successes. One that stands out in particular is Netflix's Stranger Things, an original, inventive sci-fi series set in the nostalgic backdrop of 80s America, where a group of boys discover a mysterious girl in the woods. It seemingly became a hit overnight, dominating the traditional water cooler conversations. As it draws closer to its final season, I begin to reflect on not only its impact, but the expectation that it has left for other shows to live up to. It's easy to imagine that the show has become something of a benchmark for how Netflix quantifies success. The issue with this logic, of course, is that not every show will be like Stranger Things, and personally I don't think that's a bad thing. Overnight success isn't for every show, and sometimes word of mouth can take a while. If you're an executive who has to decide whether a show lives or dies by comparing it to a once-in-a-blue-moon success like Stranger Things, then you will overlook so much potential. It's clear that streaming isn't going away anytime soon, but perhaps TV production companies should reevaluate how they approach the shows they make. I think a good way to start would be to take a longer time period after the show has been released to decide if it is worth pursuing. I also believe that while initial viewing figures and revenue statistics can be a good indicator of success, social media is a very useful tool to gauge how popular a show truly is, especially with a niche audience. Granted, it may still be a small population than originally hoped for, but it still shows that there are many people dedicated to consuming the product that you have released. Streaming can't be a viable alternative if it ends up working the exact same way as traditional TV production. People are already exhausted by the fact that they need to subscribe to multiple streaming platforms. At the very least, there should be more care taken into the process to make it worthwhile. We are currently seeing the beginning of a vicious cycle where shows are cancelled because there isn't enough interest. But audiences don't want to engage in a show if they know it will just get immediately cancelled. When you combine this with the rise of subscription costs, I think there is a lot of work to be done to restore public faith. However, there is still room to trade being cautious for being cautiously optimistic. Perhaps the fact that streaming platforms continue to take risks on original content in the first place is reason enough to believe they'll invest in the care to make them succeed.